Hello, everyone. Welcome to Nine Gates Podcast on July 7th, 2026. We just got past the 4th of July weekend. I hope you all had a great weekend. Hello, Victoria. How you doing tonight?
I'm doing good, James. How about you?
I'm doing pretty good. How was your 4th?
Um, I didn't really do much. I gotta be honest. I meant to go outside and watch fireworks because, they were exploding everywhere, but mostly I was inside with my cats. They were very scared.
Oh, I can imagine. Yeah, you said you had a lot of rainstorms lately. We had heat. Now it's raining, so I guess it's starting to come from your area.
I guess so. Here you go.
Yeah, you can keep it. I'm sick of it already. I'd rather get the heat back.
Okay. It's keeping it cool down here. I like the rain right now a lot.
Well, talking about heat tonight, we have an amazing guest talking about a topic that I dearly love. I'm not going to plug it again, but I am. The History of Demonology. I wrote a book on it, came out in April. And so I'm very excited to have Kyle on because I have followed him for a long time. I know you have followed him. And actually, talk to him for your new release of your book if you want to plug that out because it is available now.
I would hold it up like you just did, but I am currently out. I was just at Haunted America and all my copies sold out. People really liked the presentation I did to go with it. So right now I'm just waiting on different shipments to come in so that I can start selling it back on my Shopify. And also my mom makes spooky things.
Hmm.
This particular quilt behind me is not, on the site. She hated this one. So it's mine now. But
Well,
she makes spooky stuff and really beautiful quilted Halloween stuff if you guys want to check it out.
yeah, no, she does. I got a couple things from the book that I ordered. Your first one, which is great book so far, the Black Hours. And if you haven't read that one, the first and second one, are different in ways, but you can see that your love for the topic and what you bring forth into it, the research you do, which kind of resonates with myself and of course Kyle tonight. So it's like, but if you haven't read Victoria's books, please do so. If you haven't read my books, please do so. Of course, we have the shameless plug. We put a lot of hours and blood, sweat, and tears into writing these things and the way we write them. And we try to uh, give feedback and important information people maybe misconstrive or uh, don't know.
Yeah, exactly. We love this. Like that's why we're writing about it, and it takes sometimes a few years. Like sometimes the idea is there, like Hell, Horror, and Despair, Demonic Fantasy and Film is my second book.
Hmm.
And I had that idea about like what's going on with the 90s and like the way we see demon films now. And that had started back, I think, in like 2022. But it was just ruminating for a few years. And then the paranormal community, um, every single time I would go to a con, or I'd really interact with people online who were also part of the paranormal community, they would be like, oh, like they hear I work with demon stuff and demonology, and they're the involuntary eye roll. And it's like, I get it. I understand why people feel that way because everything is a demon narrative, especially from paranormal television, um, has really taken over and it's become pervasive. And it's to the point, like, true story, I called my bank to get my card not shut down as I was driving across 4 states. And she was asking me, oh, are you traveling for work? And I was like, well, I'm going to Haunted America. And she wanted to know what that was. And I told her I was a speaker. She wanted to know what I did. And then I had to correct a demonic fantasy that
Mm.
she said because she assumed something. I think about how like TV shows or demon movies are like a portal and they can enter your life. And I was like, oh, nope, that's not how that works. But also, it was a really good conversation. So if you're listening, like this is not meant to embarrass you or anything like that. It was just that to show that this is very common. People really think demons are everywhere and they're not. Um, so
Yeah, and you know what's interesting about that topic is, when we speak about the history with Kyle tonight, is we have definitely developed and evolved, right? Back then, it was deities and demons, or these malevolent and benevolent beings that played kind of the human fiddle of why things would happen. And so it's going to be interesting tonight about, how, of course, folklore has expanded and it evolved, but also the ideas of, religions, beliefs, you know, totemistic belief systems, and all these other cultures that have developed with a common viewpoint, or viewpoints that kind of dispersed from, the central point of Africa. So it's going to be interesting tonight to talk to Kyle about the history and how maybe people have taken these historical notes and, maybe adjusted them or scrambled them up, and they went that each, generation it passed down, they gobble it up, they change things, they make it more entertaining, and how
Mhm,
a lot of the things we believe in now are a lot of garbled messes of things that were all mixed together throughout the cultural expansion of humanity.
mhm.
And so it'll be interesting to get Kyle's perspective on it because he's very smart. And I'm super stoked about this episode. I'm super stoked about any topic or any episode we have on this show because, as we've said in the first episode with John Zaffis, Introduction to Demonology, we're learning. We're also maybe teaching people, and to me, that's the best thing humans can do is learn and understand the differences, and at most points, the many similarities we all have.
Mhm,
And with a topic that we both know is a jarbled mess of a lot of different viewpoints, especially when it comes to like the average normal day Joe and Jill, that have this misconceptions, like the person that you dealt with. And sometimes you have to think is like, oh yeah, I wonder how they got that, but that's incorrect, you know?
mhm.
And that's the point of the show, right?
Exactly. And yeah, that's the entire process of folklore. That is exactly how it works. Sometimes we don't remember the details of a story when we retell it. Sometimes we fill in the blanks because it sounds better the way
Yeah.
we are telling it.
Yep.
There's a million reasons why it happens. Memory is malleable.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm really excited to hear like a deeper dive into ancient history because of course I had to read about ancient demonology to really understand like where we started into where we are now. But I'm definitely not an expert on the history of demonology, and you just wrote a book on it. So I think this is going to be more of a learning episode for me, but I'm really excited.
And I'm truly gonna probably learn something from Kyle too. I don't know if you have anything else to add before I read his bio and bring him on, but I'm getting excited
No.
because when we talk about experts, and I'm not going to call them that because I know that is a fugue word for some people about, hey, I'm not an expert, I'm a specialist, or respected. So I don't want to call him expert out of lieu. If he says he is, then that's up to his interpretation. But yeah, so you're all good.
We're good.
All right. So, for the masses, for the unknown, for the people that are first tuning into this show that have nothing to do with the paranormal, our guest tonight, speaking about the history of demonology with us, is Kyle Cobb. Kyle T. Cobb Jr. is a well-respected author, historian, demonologist, paranormal investigator, and international lecturer who combines history, religion, folklore, and the supernatural in his work. Having researched and investigated over 60 countries for nearly 40 years, Cobb has developed a strong reputation for critically assessing numerous high profile paranormal claims through both scholarly, historical approaches and evidence based assessments. Cobb has published extensively, including the popular Ghost and Demon series, The History and Hauntings of the Thomas House Hotel, The Griffin, Georgia, We Could Have Been Famous History series, and the Love God trilogy. In addition to his publishing career, Cobb has consulted for organizations such as CNN and Turner Broadcasting, the United Nations, and the U.S. Air Force in Europe. As a soon to be doctoral student in ancient religions at the University of Wales Trinity St. David, Cobb continues to travel globally, presenting lectures on topics that includes demonology, comparative religions, ancient civilizations, and the historical roots of paranormal traditions by using a combination of academic rigor and lifelong extraordinary global experience. Wow. Let's bring him on. Hey, Kyle.
Hi
Hey,
there,
Kyle.
how are y'all?
We're good.
Pretty good. I hope you liked your bio. I summed it up out of 5 pages, man, and I was reading it and I was drooling because of the experiences and things you have done. I'm glad I could do you justice in that little span of a paragraph or two, but I'm glad to have you on tonight.
I appreciate you having me. I'm
And
excited.
congrats on starting your PhD, Kyle. That's so cool.
I know. It's daunting. The
It's real.
dissertation. I'm going to the University of Wales Trinity St. David, and it's been remote. So the master's program there, I took a different course. It's not like a regular master's program. I took a research master's.
Mhm.
And so, in essence, what that meant is every semester I'm writing, you know, 50 word, or excuse me, 50-page papers regularly. And
Mhm.
then at the end of it, you write an actual dissertation, a full dissertation. And that's finally been done. And I have a life for a few weeks anyway.
Until that starts.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah,
real.
I think we all feel you here. Victoria has her master's in folklore, and I'm 4 classes away. Next, actually, July this day next year, July 7th, actually, will finish my master's program in psychology. Knock on wood, everything goes smoothly, and I continue doing. But I'll have my master's in psychology, so we'll all be all in that master's bandwagon together. And I think with your doctorate, and maybe Victoria will maybe one day, and maybe
I
me.
don't know.
But we all know how hard that is to get to that. Especially in research heavy uh, degrees such as ancient religions, folklore, psychology. We it's a lot. And when I hear you say you have some peace now for a little bit, I think we all feel that.
For me, it's just a rallying point before I start the next book. So
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, so are you going to turn your dissertation into a new a book? Because you've done a lot of research on it. I read, I follow you, and I saw your recent post. Do you plan to form that into a book?
I think so, sort of. So I tend to focus a lot on the ancient goddesses just because. And I've also, this dissertation that's just completed is actually looking at the linkage between Inanna, who's a Sumerian early goddess, uh, and she eventually is merged into the goddess Ishtar. And then after that, there's a kind of a break because Ishtar becomes kind of this all being goddess. She basically becomes similar to the Christian God in that she's a goddess for, you know, 2,500 years that's
Mm,
worshipped. And then from my perspective, I go the next step to a goddess you've never heard of called Anat. And Anat actually is mentioned in the Bible under different names, but she is actually what's important about her and Ishtar and Inanna, and then I also throw in just for fun in the dissertation Demeter and Persephone. But the idea is the afterlife.
Mhm.
How do people fundamentally address their fear of dying?
mm.
And so I trace it through that path. And for me, it was there were some things. That's the reality of every human life, right? We're all going to die at some point.
Mhm.
Some of us more often than others, but the whole thing is how we deal with it, and that is kind of hand in hand with when we start talking about demonology or daemonology. I tend to use the term daemonology, by the way, because demonology has such negative connotations these days. Um, where the term daemon is actually the Greek term
Hmm.
for, and it's not a negative Greek term. So let me throw out a definition since I'm on a ramble. All right. From the Greek perspective, there were three layers of divinity. There's the theos, which is the divinity in away from Earth. So if you're in the period of Zeus and the Olympians, it's Zeus, Apollo, Athena, Hera, whoever on Olympus, away from the world. Then the next level is a daemon. That's any divinity coming to Earth. So it's Zeus when he takes the form of a swan, or it could also be Heracles, Hercules. It could be Achilles, who's half god. It could be a Medusa. Anything that's a divinity on Earth. And then the third level is called a demonium. And we would think of that today as kind of like a guardian angel, sort of. It's an intangible. Um, there are Greek stories where Plato and Socrates are warned by their demoniums that something's going to happen to them. And so they change the path that they would have taken that day, only to discover that there's a plot to kill them. And had they gone the regular way, they would have been killed. So those three, when you take those three levels, a daemon is just a divinity on earth. When the Greeks became Christianized, then, and it wasn't just the Greeks being Christianized, but it was the imposition of Christianity on the Greek writings.
Hmm.
That means that the gods in heaven, or God in heaven, Jesus in heaven, whatever, is a theo or theos, theology, or when Jesus is on earth, he's technically a daemon.
Yeah.
And then when they started translating the Bible from the Greek and from earlier forms of Hebrew, which had been already converted to Greek in the Septuagint, which is the 70, they knew the words, the monks translating it, but in some cases they didn't know the connotation. And so they merged the idea of a daemon and a demonium, which a demonium is immortal, intangible, and invisible. They merged that with a daemon. And so suddenly the daemons, or eventually demons, no longer had a physicality. You couldn't hurt them. You couldn't kill them. They were immortal.
Hmm.
And that's where the concept in today's modern Christian perspective of an exorcism comes in. An exorcism isn't designed to kill a demon, it's designed to ask him to leave really nicely. And so that's kind of sets the foundation of all this. So I'm sorry for that whole diversion
No,
there.
we
Yeah.
want this, Kyle. This is the good stuff.
This is what we want. A lot of people, when I wrote my book, The History of Demonology, I loosely wrote it in the sense for an average reader, right? I wanted it to be approachable for people to see how the idea of it has evolved. A lot of people don't realize the New Testament was originally written in Greek, right? So you had a lot of that influence of that Greek mythology, that
Mhm.
Greek writing, that that philosophical viewpoint that kind of flourished in Christianity. It's a great point. A lot of people, for some reason, misstep that all the time to realize a lot of that influence. We see a lot of that influence in science today, in medicine, and I always tell people, like, even the great thinkers back then played on the levels of a Carl Jung or Sigmund Freud, and thought things and thought about outer ego and all this and collective unconsciousness, where a lot of those ideas stem from a lot of philosophy as well. To me, they were more philosophers than actual psychologists, because they really thought more than actually applied scientific data. But it's interesting to see a lot of that combination and those viewpoints transition and flourish. But what I find interesting, and I want to bring to the point, and you can answer it. But what I find interesting, right, that the good and evil, the theodical nature, right, Epicurus, Theodicies, um, is you see it throughout many different cultures, even cultures that didn't, breathe with Christianity or Abrahamic religions. Hinduism, prime example, they had that divinity, that good versus evil battle, right? To a degree. And many other cultures, a lot of African mythologies have that same viewpoint. But one of the viewpoints that I always harp on, and especially that, maybe there were a lot more cultures. We predate ourselves now to 250,000 plus years. Used to be 10,000 years. Now we start going maybe a million. There was a recent finding up to a million, possibly. And we are starting to uncover maybe those layers. We found that temple in Turkey from 12,000 years ago with actual figurines and sculptures, things that we didn't think that they were capable of doing back then. But when we, cuneiform with Sumerians and Mesopotamia explosion, you see a lot of that dichotomy, that good versus evil. We talk about Lamash. I talk about Lamashtu a lot. You can even get a lot of the Lilith roots from Samaria into the Judaism viewpoints, at least later Judaism viewpoints. But so my question is, what is your take on the good versus evil in many different cultures that didn't even experience each other too? That fascinates me in the historical sense, not maybe the cultural sense or uh, our genetics and how we have genetic memories and stuff. What do you think on the historical point? What makes you fascinated about that?
Well, there's a few ways to cut that onion. I think one of the things to understand about our human existence is, you know, you mentioned humans, Homo sapiens, could have been around as long as a million years. We at least know that Homo sapiens have been around for 300,000 years. And, we know that because we discovered a place called Jebel Irhoud actually had some evidence to assert the fact that it was humans, Homo sapiens. The interesting thing, though, is when we look at other types of humanoids, particularly Neanderthal, we know that Neanderthals at least go back to 800,000 years ago.
Hmm.
And the fascinating thing that we discover is, as the let me back up. Yet another aside. Humans evolved in an ice age. We are still in an ice age. The definition of an ice age means that we have ice on the polar caps. We, for every 150,000 years or so of ice, severe cold, we enter into what's called an interglacial period. And that interglacial period lasts somewhere around 14,000 years. Our last interglacial period got broken, and I'll talk about that later on. But my point being, during the last glacial maximum, humans had started to move either, depending on your perspective, either up from Africa or west from Asia, because there's evidence now that says humans may have evolved in Asia. But they clashed with the people who owned Europe. And the creatures that owned Europe were the Neanderthals. And Neanderthals aren't these brutish, stupid individuals that pop culture had made them out to be for 100 years. They were smart as we were. They had brains like we did, the same size roughly. They were physically much more powerful. One of the theories is the idea that maybe they didn't communicate as well as we did, or they had a kind of autistic tendency not to want to associate as much with each other. My point of mentioning the Neanderthals is the Neanderthals almost hunted humanity to extinction. So we know, as we look back at the history, that somewhere between 70 and 40,000 years ago, humanity was obliterated. We went from a thriving population down to around a few thousand. And we can tell that because as you do the DNA sequencing, you can actually see that the women kind of survived, the men were killed off. And there are example after example of Neanderthals, of skulls of humans that are smashed to eat the brains, basically. And the very fact that if you are not of African descent, you can have 4 to 5% of your DNA as Neanderthal. If you're African descent, it's 0.5% or less. Shows that there was interbreeding going on. And so I think in a lot of ways, the Neanderthals became our boogeyman. They became the creature that was hunting us. And we define really good and evil by good is that which helps us, evil is that harms us. And so I think culturally, we carried this we're being hunted idea down. And eventually we became the problem ourselves because as we developed, and one of the other things that's, I think, totally wrong with history, and it's finally beginning to reveal itself. I'm an old person. And when I was young, they told us that before Sumer, we were all hunter gatherers. So before about 4,500 BC, we were hunter gatherers. In 1995, that all got thrown away. In 1995, we discovered a place called Göbekli Tepe, which is in Turkey.
Mhm.
And it has these colossal, for lack of a better term, temples. There's actually allegedly evidence of a city around it, but they won't let us dig there for lots of other philosophical reasons. Um, but so Göbekli Tepe's been frozen for the most part until some internal politics can be resolved, because it clashes with some of the religious aspects that impact Turkey at this point. But one of the other things that they discovered, so with these temples, if you could build temples that large, it suddenly became, well, you can't be hunter-gatherers and build 40-foot monoliths that are actually probably, they could be a roof, or they could just be these giant pillars that have effigies on them. If you look at some of the, if you Google, if you're a viewer out there that doesn't know Göbekli Tepe, go Google it. The photos are amazing. And some of the things that we think that we know from there is there are some that they believe actually tell us a story about the last time mankind was destroyed. Göbekli Tepe roughly was created about 9,700 roughly BC, and we believe that the world may or may not have been destroyed somewhere between 9,800 and 9,600 by a great flood. And there's a lot of scientific evidence to kind of support that. But what's interesting about that is, by the way, if you're one of those folks that are looking for Atlantis, if you look at the Plato where he's actually describing Atlantis and back up the timeline, he tells you the timeline for Atlantis corresponds to the end of what's called the Younger Dryas, which was a large-scale worldwide flood. The interesting thing about Göbekli Tepe, and to kind of go full circle with this, we have since discovered that Göbekli Tepe isn't alone, that it's actually surrounded. Göbekli Tepe is up on a plateau, so it's above where when the Great Flood happened from the end of the Younger Dryas, it was not impacted. It basically, they believe that when the Younger Dryas ended, it may have been from a comet or an asteroid, or more than likely a solar flare. It melted the ice sheet over North America and caused giant floods, and the ocean level went up 400 feet. And some say as soon as a day. I don't think it was a day. I think it was within a week's period of time. But you can actually find a sediment layer all over the earth.
Mm.
And so these people at Göbekli Tepe survived. Well, as we've searched that area, we now know that there's somewhere between 14 and 16 cities that were built, that some of them are before the end of the Younger Dryas. So when they've done the calculations, they say, well, it's possible that as many as 100,000 people lived in these 100,000 hunter-gatherers, these primitive people built cities. There's one called Katahuyuk that in our infinite wisdom we let be destroyed and turned into a reservoir. But when they did the research on that, there were actually sewer systems. And there were, all of these modern conveniences. Well, not modern from our standards, but there were things that you shouldn't have in a city 10,000 years old or 12,000 years old. And so it begins to change the story of our history. So I think at some point, when we're talking about good and evil, we became, first we were hunted. And so the evil was some giant furry creatures that could or could not be later on, thousands of years later, considered demonic. But then it also became us as individuals. We became our own bad guys, right? Because we were competing for resources in a destroyed Earth. And, some of the stories of gods may very well have been the survivors of this giant flood going out and having to become hunter-gatherers again because their civilizations are destroyed. But the people that did survive, maybe they reached out and helped rebuild society. And they became the Enkis, which is the Sumerian god of wisdom and builder and one of the creator types. They became the god Thoth, the Egyptian god of knowledge, who invents writing. They became these figures that became legendary for recreating humanity. And so I think when we boil it down, that our cultural memory lasts way beyond our ability to preserve written documents. There's something you may be aware of. This, I don't know if you've heard of the Silurian hypothesis.
I believe so. Yeah.
It doesn't sound familiar. Would you explain it for me?
Yeah.
Sure. So any Doctor Who fans out there know from the 70s and some later episodes, the Silurians were supposed to be this lizard race that evolved from the dinosaurs and had gone underground. And some brilliant people, a couple gentlemen, decided, well, let's investigate the idea if I had a society contemporary to what the world is now, and this was back in 1985, a very primitive time. So, but if you had a society like that, and that society was to end quickly, whatever the cause, plague, natural disaster, the earth has been completely wiped out of the vast majority of life 5 times already. Some would say 6. So if something like that happened, would you be able to find evidence of it existing? And the conclusion was, after 100,000 years, almost everything that's part of society disappears. So when we talk about our history, we don't know what we don't know. Like I said, I'm an old man, and when I was in school, they told us 4,500 BC was the beginning of everything. So I think we've kind of carried this idea forward. And I will mention part of what's helped from at least the Western perspective to solidify the idea of good and evil is a religion called Zoroastrianism. Ashura Mazda was the good god, and he had an equivalent of an opponent, a devil-like figure that they would fight between each other. And that's where the idea of angels comes from. It's, he introduced, or the Zoroaster was the prophet, and he introduced the idea that there were these emissaries that that fought on behalf of good and evil. So anyway, I know I got on this long diversion. I apologize, but
No, we're loving this. I'm riveted.
from my perspective, what at this point, what got me into looking at Inanna for the dissertation in the first place was a fringe theory. I was doing some heavy duty research on Göbekli Tepe and also working on translating. So before we found Göbekli Tepe, this is another aside, before we found Göbekli Tepe, all throughout the Middle East, we would find little pottery shards. And I don't have one with me. I meant to pull it out and I forgot. But we would find little pottery shards, and they would have like stick figures and drawings on them. And these were just dismissed as art. And because you couldn't explain it, because obviously if you're hunter-gatherers, you don't have time for, writing, and there's no such thing as writing. But what we discovered is that there is a pattern. So if I have a zigzag line, and that zigzag line underneath it has a handprint, and I have another zigzag line and a handprint, could this be a warning to someone about snakes? Or could this be a warning to someone about water? And so these were communicating stuff. And what we've begun to find out is that there's a whole catalog of exactly the same signs off a large geographic area and through a large geographic time. So it's beginning to come to the forefront that maybe there's an earlier writing system. And the funny thing is, when you start talking about Göbekli Tepe, there's another site called Karahan Tepe, but I won't get in that diversion. But when you start looking, Göbekli Tepe is famous because it's got these giant 3D reliefs of lions and boars and humans, and it's got all of this giant things, and that's what gets the attention. But what they don't really talk about is all throughout the ruins, there are these small signs everywhere. And it may very well be that that's telling us a lot of the story. And again, mentioning Göbekli Tepe, part of there's this idea of there's a pillar 43, and one of the theories from it has a picture of a vulture, and it has a kind of a net below it, and there's a scorpion. One of the theories is that that's a calendar telling us when the world ended. Because if you take that and put it against a star map and roll the time back to about 9,800-ish, it matches.
Oh.
So there's just, we as humans, we think, we use the term history as a bias, because what history literally to us it means is the recorded things that we have on basically paper or stone that we can read. But the experience of humanity goes way back further, and it's way more detailed. And so what got me interested so much in the whole story is this. I don't think he's a crackpot. Everybody else thinks he was. But at Göbekli Tepe, there is, on one of the columns or pillars, there is a letter H, right? And when you look at the letter H, it's actually two humans facing each other holding hands. And one of the thoughts is this 4,000 years later becomes the symbol for the goddess Inanna, or one of the representations, because she has the first marriage with the god Dumuzi. And so this writer suggested that possibly the old religion at Göbekli Tepe is eventually, at least in some way, shape, or form, 4,000 years later, inherited as part of the early Sumerian. And
I have a question actually.
Sure.
How, or does these early goddesses, how does it relate to Asherah?
Asher is much, much later.
Oh, okay. I figured, but like, does it have that lineage, or is it from a different source?
The answer is sort of. So one of the things that, at least as I'm looking at evolution, I have to be very careful about is assumptions. So we know that the goddess Inanna is later blended with the goddess Ishtar, and for 2,500 years, give or take, they are written about as one goddess, but they have separate origins. Then about 1800, 2000 BC, let me back up. I do this a lot. I'm sorry.
Sorry,
They're
Um,
good.
I didn't mean to throw you
so
off.
from the Christian, the Judeo-Christian perspective, you are told that Abraham comes from the city of Uruk, which is in the Sumerian region, right? And at that time, Sumer was subordinate to the Akkadian Empire, Akkadian or Akkadian Empire. And that's who eventually merges Ishtar and Inanna. And that becomes an empire for just a few hundred years, but it's one of the first real empires. Abraham, we are then told, so Abraham comes from Uruk, which is Akkadian, so he is educated to all of these Sumerian gods and goddesses, and all of the Akkadian gods and goddesses. We're told he goes to Haran, which is kind of north, and eventually goes back down toward the south along the coast, which is we think of today as Israel, right? But that was also the Canaanite Empire at one point. And the Canaanite pantheon, before it really gets solidified, there's a seaport called Ugarit, and Ugarit's kind of the prototype. If you know the name Israel, the L in Israel means the God, right? The chief deity of the Ugaric pantheon is El. One of the insignificant gods in the Canaanite and Ugaric pantheon is the god Yahweh, who's a volcano god. You see, Asherah there is married to El.
Mhm.
Well, in the Ugaric stories, they basically another person you've heard of, particularly as a demonologist, a gentleman by the name of Hadad, who's the rain and storm god.
Mhm.
Well, Hadad was the rain and storm god in the Akkadian Empire, one of them. He's inherited. He becomes the central figure. He overthrows El and takes control of the Ugaritic Empire or the Ugaritic pantheon. That's where my goddess Annat comes into play because she works for Baal, or they're maybe lovers, who knows? But they have a relationship. She's his enforcer. But I mention all of this because what happens is, so the tribes of Israel is a euphemism. It really means the distinct religious groups of Semitic language speakers that were kind of clustered together that eventually either died off or merged to become the Jewish tradition.
Hmm.
And so what happens naturally from that is when the God Yahweh is elevated, he still has a wife, right? But eventually the Hebrew Jewish faith goes through a modification, and basically they reorganize it. King Josiah, Josie. Anyway, it goes through a modification. Ashura is kind of thrown away, though you can find her in the Old Testament mentioned in a few places. The pole of Ashura, which used to be in all the Jewish worship sites, is mentioned. Also, there's references to the council, Yahweh speaking to the council of gods and talking about how he as a god was only given Israel, and if you left his territory, you had to worship another god, and that's why they eventually built the Ark of the Covenant. And again, I'm all over the place. I apologize, but what this tells us is that because Yahweh's worshipers that became the Jewish tradition, as they solidified and became solely Yahweh focused, they had to take the competing members of that pantheon and do one of two things to them. So, and this gets us into, I guess, the core of at least the Western idea of demons. if you are a God that is compatible with our belief system, you became an angel. So Raphael, which we now translate as the healer of God, wasn't. He was the God of healing.
Oh.
We find that if you were one who was outside of the ability to merge with Yahweh, Baal, remember, Baal's a title. Baal's not a name, it's a title. It means the Lord. If you are Baal and you are the most popularly worshipped god in the Mediterranean at the time, and this is true, they worshipped Hadad from the eastern Mediterranean all the way across to Morocco. And there's even some evidence of Baal in Spain today, or Portugal. I can't remember. In that region, there's evidence of Baal. And so you made him the bad guy. That's why if you read the Old Testament carefully and you're looking for this, it's the priests of Yahweh are in opposition to the priest of Baal to prove which one of their gods is real. And so you deify them. You make them the bad guys.
Mhm.
The other thing to think about is you also do the contrast. It's important to understand that all religions during the early Jewish periods sacrificed their firstborn child. Human sacrifice was normal to appease the gods. And so that's one of the reasons why specifically in the Jewish tradition, they make it a point that doesn't happen anymore.
Yeah.
Substitute.
The goats, Holocaust. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So, as we're looking at these things, it's how do you keep your religion isolated? And that's where things like food prohibitions come into play. That's where things like marrying only in your tribe come into play. So it's the idea of separating it. And in the case of Hadad, there's actually some evidence going backwards. Hadad's symbol was a bull, which there's parallel to the Apis bull in Egypt. There are all throughout the Middle East. Zeus is one of his symbols as a bull. You have the Minotaur. You have, and as you go backwards, linguists, far smarter than I ever will be, have taken the world's languages and they said, okay, there are some words that have a common core that predate our written language. And so some of them are like mama or ma or something that means mother, right? Has a similar kind of core sound. And one of the other words that they came up with was basically several iterations in was Deo or Dio or Deus, as the Greek word for God would have been, and or Dios is the modern Spanish. And they said, well, if we go backwards with that, what do we find? And so looking at the symbology of the bull, looking at the language origins, you find it as you go back, the earliest linguistic name we have for a storm god is Daius. And they Greekified it, but so hence the Eus at the end. But they refer to him as Daius Pater, the father sky god. And I'll tell you kind of a funny. The name of in Latin, right? Of the well, let me back up before I give you the funny. I'm all over the place. I apologize. I say that enough. But when we start talking, I'll back up before I back up. So the current name in Latin for the word God is Deus, right? But there was a problem. That name was already taken. The word Zeus, the name Zeus, is Deus.
Oh.
We basically the name, you couldn't have the Greek All Father the same as the Christian god. So you change the pronunciation of Zeus. And part of where this all gets even more complicated, and this was the digression I almost made but didn't. The name Yahweh is now prohibited, right? Because of the commandments, you shall not use the Lord thy God's name in vain, is the kind of the New Testament, or not the New Testament, but the Christianized King Jamesy version of the commandment. But what it really means is not the name God. The name God is a title. Why? Because Baal Hadad had become so popular that people stopped calling him Hadad. They just said the Lord.
Oh.
And so as part of the competition between the young Jewish religion and this massive Hadad structure, they said, well, if their God is too important to use his name, our God should be just as important. And so as a result, they basically said, okay, you can only write the name Yahweh, and this was about 1st century BC. That's when this part of the transition occurred. And they said you can only write that name in stone, and otherwise you have to use one of his titles. You have to call him the Lord, Adonai. So it basically began to treat him, and you can actually you see this carried on to the Christian era, where if you say, well, what's the name of your God, and they'll say the Lord or God. No, those are titles. What's the name? And 2,000 years later, people don't know the origin of their own religious concept. But anyway, that's what eventually leads to the idea that Zeus becomes anyway, long.
Well, yeah. What's interesting though is like a lot to unpack there. Which some things I'm learning, some things I already knew, and I think one of our listeners said we're all earning a degree tonight, which is actually a phenomenal actually comment because you're putting out so much information. A lot of people don't know unless they go down this journey. I think about like the Great Flood, a redo Genesis or Gilgamesh. Talking about that area, you talk about the Minoans with 3000 BCE to 2000 BCE. They also had indoor plumbing around 2000 BCE. I'm a tradesman, so I find it fascinating that they were able to understand shit needs to go on a pipe downhill. So I find that all fascinating. I find that a lot of these common stories, you know, are very similar, right? You see that competition, you see that our pantheon's better than your pantheon, and that fighting between cultures, something that we haven't learned from this day because we still do it to this day, and still get violent about it to this day. There was wars and bloodshed back then during those situations and persecution, but I find it all fascinating that how you lay it out and how you basically say, your religious belief. You might believe in it. Like I'm a Christian, but I always say I'm an eclectic Christian because I understand there's so much more, right? As a person that loves Eastern religions like Shintoism and Hinduism, i- which are much older in a modern sense than Abrahamic religions, but you see the differences, but you also see those commonalities, like you're talking about, like the flood. You talk about regional interest in certain pantheons and how that has cross competition. Maybe empire, the Akkadian Empire gets taken over, and some of their beliefs get injected into that other belief. Actually, a pretty famous example of this was the Mongolians, right? They were the largest empire to exist by land mass, and they one of the things they did is kill and pillage, but they incorporated a lot of the people they killed and pillaged into their belief. And a lot of them still to this day. I've never been to Mongolia, but I've read a lot of stuff on it, watched a lot of documentaries. A lot of them aren't still changed from those days. They still incorporate so many different cultures and beliefs and ideas into their culture. In certain segments, of course, it's not a big country, but it's a decent sized country. So I find it all fascinating. Where I'm going with it, before I go on too much, because I get excited. My ancient Italian blood. We like to talk with the hands and talk fast and speak rapidly. But what one thing that I want to ask you is, through all this digging and research and going down these rabbit holes, um, is there something, and this is taking the history out of it for a second, because I think history impacts us as a person, as individuals, but as well our social norms. Is there anything that you've taken out of that and this is an assumption, so you can correct me, has strengthened your faith or demoralized your faith? Where do you feel like that essence of what you believe is mirrored and reciprocated in those beliefs? If you understand that question.
Mhm. Yeah, that in and of itself is a tough question. I'm Anglican at this point, but at the same time, part of what converted me to become an Anglican, that's Church of England for those
Yep.
of you who aren't familiar with it, was at one point in my journey. So what started me on this whole path, my father died when I was 17,
Sorry
and
to hear that.
it was a traumatic experience. And that kind of led me on this religious quest. I was given a kind of a head start in it because when I was 13, I had a wonderful college professor who gave up teaching at the college to come teach my middle school to take care of his parents. And so he decided he would make us do things like at 13 read the Iliad and the Odyssey
Mm.
and Greek plays. And so I was exposed to this secondary religion. Back then, I had an unusual superpower that I still wish I had. I was at one point considered a language adept, which meant I could learn written languages very, very, very quickly. So in seventh grade, I was able to read Ovid and in the actual Latin, and my Latin teacher couldn't do it. It was just a ability that I had. I lost it about 2 decades ago when I was adventuring in Mexico and um, had an accident that took that away.
Hmm.
But I still have the ability sometimes to read a lot of written languages. I can't speak them at all. I have trouble sometimes even speaking English, but the written languages I can still do fairly well. I mean, just for the dissertation, I was doing Greek, Latin, Egyptian, Turkish, and the list goes on. So, I mean, it's just part of it. But I guess my whole deviation down that line, um, as I've gone through and kind of tried to understand what does it all mean. Um, Honestly, I don't know. It is the more you learn, the sometimes the less clear the pathway becomes. And the reason is you start to see patterns in religion. You start to see the same things that we take for granted in Christianity were already being discussed about in other religions thousands of years earlier. You start to see part of one of the big things for me is ritual. So as I'm looking at ancient texts, I find baptism started as an exorcism spell. So the Christian concept of baptism is inherited from the Jewish concept of baptism and purification, which came before that in the Ugaric tradition, which came before that in the Babylonian, which came before that in the Akkadian, which came before that in the Sumerian.
Hmm.
and is actually the is part of the purification rituals for exorcism. The actual exorcism ritual itself,
Yeah,
the
because
the original.
they had the sipu, if I'm saying that right,
Mhm.
which were those cleansers, those exorcists.
And the thing is, what as yet another diversion down that road. The thing about that's cool about that is the Sumerians and Akkadians believed that illness were caused by demons. Again, what's good is positive, but what's negative is bad guys. So you think
Mhm.
of if it's hurting you, it's something demonic. And so they developed what is jokingly called in the academic field a cookbook, which lists all of these different illnesses and what the treatments are, what the magic spells are you use to exorcise the demons out.
Mhm.
Hmm.
And the funny thing is, the ritual ingredients that you use for the exorcism are actually in and of themselves medical components.
Hmm.
And not to be a specific example, but the idea of aspirin we got from leaves, right, in the rainforest. But it's the same idea. Is when you look at it from a medical perspective, that's really what the power of exorcisms were.
Hmm.
But they also included in them things like the purification rituals by water.
Hmm.
So they would not only um, required you to wash your mouth and your teeth because that was good for your health hygiene, but it was also good ritualistically, right?
Yeah.
And so we get so many things from that. And one of the interesting things, there's a tablet called KAR 44, which is a protection spell. And that literally walks you through the prayers and the ritual. And you start to see, hey, this is what really kind of gets handed down and eventually becomes the indirectly the kind of the Catholic exorcism.
Mm.
And it's still practiced today, and it has the same components. It has prayers to a deity to invoke. It has purification rituals as part of it. It has admonishments to get rid of the evil, to cast it
Mm.
out, to go away. It then follows up with uh, an invocation to a deity to then protect that individual.
Mm.
And it has, in some cases, application of, I mentioned elements that act as a healing element. So, in the Catholic perspective, it's the sprinkling of holy water,
Hmm.
the that the whole sacrament ish, the whole sacrament portion of it. So when we start looking at these things, we start seeing, hey, we aren't that different than we were
Mm.
6,000, 7,000 years ago.
Mm.
We've changed the names, we've changed some of the rules, but fundamentally, religion is religion is religion.
Yeah.
And one of the things I lecture about a lot, and I've written about it. There's something called the Alexandrian Divide, and so Alexander the Great conquered the world at one point. Well, we say that, but he didn't really. He got as far as India, turned around, and then went and conquered Egypt. And what happens, though, in that area that Alexander conquered, we refer to it as being Hellenized. The Greek religion, kind of, and Greek philosophy, kind of was overlayered. And the interesting thing is, to the west of that line where Alexander stopped in India, we all kind of developed again the idea of the deities being invisible, immortal, intangible, and that kind of stuck. It kind of moved forward with that general idea. Zoroastrianism gets thrown in there too, but that's a whole different rabbit
Mm.
hole. But the idea is, so west of the Alexandrian line we have that. But if you go east where Alexandrian didn't go, you see that the demons there are very, very similar to what they were in ancient Sumer.
Mm.
And it goes all the way. So you find that the demons starting in India, moving all the way across, the general kind of the default prototypical stereotypical character. There's something called the Rakshasa. I'm sure you've run into that. But
Mm-hmm.
the idea is they are physical like you and me.
Mm-hmm.
They can make themselves appear to be something else. So whether they shapeshift or just confuse people's understanding of what they're seeing,
Mm-hmm.
but that iconic type of demon goes all the way across. You see it in every culture um, east of the Alexandrian line, and then when you get to Japan, it's the Oni.
Mm-hmm.
So it's right there the idea of the stranger outside the village who can hunt and kill you. But even more so is then if you jump over to North and South America, they also have that same stereotypical type of demon.
Mm-hmm.
And now that they've thrown out the whole Bering Straits thing, and finally we have rationality, we understand that ancient man crossed some way, shape, or form, crossed to North and South America tens of thousands of years before we gave them credit for. The Joseph Campbell, who, even though he's outdated from a modern reader's perspective, Joseph Campbell, in his books, he did the Faces of God series, and he did
The hero's journey, and
yeah. He pointed out 30 years ago, he's like, hey, there's this gourd that we found seeds for in South America. And the interesting thing about this gourd is because it's called a bottle gourd. It was created by cultivation in Indonesia 10,000 years ago, and it didn't grow naturally. So the fact that there were bottle gourd seeds in South America that date to the same period shows that there was this. But now we're catching up.
Yeah.
Now we're finding caves in Mexico that date back 30,000 years, and we've got this whole city now in the Amazon that has highways and everything else that we've only just gotten excited about exploring. But my whole point being, we know that what they consider demons, for the most part, in some place like Samaria, 4,500 BC, they were still worshiping that in Mexico in 1490s and early 1500s.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
it's just like, wow, it changes things. And
Yeah.
I want to interject real quick.
Yeah.
So having a background in folklore, it really I think to be able to understand demonology, you have to be pulling from history, folklore, all sorts of things, because what the study of folklore is about is what does it mean to be human? And from that perspective, it is to tell stories. That is how we make sense of our world. The ancient world told stories about their world just the way we do today. I mean, how many times have you guys heard the, I don't know, portal to hell story? I've heard it in 3 different towns I lived in across the US. Everyone's got a portal to hell, apparently. This is how we relate to the world around us. This is why we tell stories. And I think that's why that binary of good versus evil, which is really is it friendly or unfriendly to humans, exists. It's because we have this tendency to think, are you with me or are you against me?
Mm.
And if you're against me, it means you're evil. That might be an oversimplification, of course, but that's what I always kind of took from it, that
Yeah.
there isn't, when you have that cultural war going on, of a god or a group of people who are worshiping a specific god, they're trying to gain dominance in a culture and take over. The reason that that's happening is because they believe their god is better. But there's a lack of understanding, even as cultural diffusion is happening. I have my bachelor's in anthropology. So you can see how they were taking from each other's cultures, even as they were warring it out, but they were still talking to each other. They were still telling stories, absorbing each other's cultures. And I find the whole thing rather beautiful, because it's this is what makes us human. We tell
Yeah.
our stories.
Yeah, I actually want to add that too. Talking about the Sumerian text about rituals. I actually wrote about it in my book, the Serpu and the Maklu. I think I'm saying those right. Part of the Burning series, which is a bunch of rituals. But kind of to add on to what Victoria's saying and what you said is that a lot of these cultures and these belief systems have very similar rituals. And
Mhm.
uh, what fascinates me on that is there, even though different names and maybe different characteristics broken out, if I believe in one god, which I do, and that's my opinion, but uh I think that in some ways that maybe if there is one being, maybe people have different viewpoints and characteristics, and gave these characteristics to these specific environmental elements, or not understanding fire, so that was a god, or volcanoes spewing lava was extravagant, and even though they were smart, and we deceive how smart, even some troglodytes were, as we call them. And how they actually adapted to the land and actually might have created, we sometimes discredit. But back to the point of ritual, because of your historical lens that you go down, and then of course being Anglican, do you think that in Victoria's sense there is, spirits that are either good to humans or not good to humans? Do you feel like because of this ritual practice throughout a lot of humanity, as we keep discovering of these continuous similar rituals, do you feel that there is a piece of the truth that this does happen and exist, and it's not just cultural tradition being passed down and psychological?
So, are you saying, are there things that go bump in the night?
In a layman's sense, yes.
I think there are. They're few and far between, and I don't want to go out on a super tangent, but I will. Um, as we learn more and more about our reality, we we realize that we know very little about our reality. And one of the theories that's always fascinated me, if you're familiar with the M theory, M is in, they jokingly say magic, but the
Mm-hmm.
M theory, some really smart mathematicians, just for the listeners out there, the viewers, you can go Google it. Go Google M theory. It's a whole wonderful exploration, but we couldn't understand why the mathematics for very small things like particles in molecules or atoms, why the mathematics for them wasn't the same as the mathematics for planets. And because math should be math should be math. And they struggled with this idea of a unified field theory for 100 years. And some gentleman back in, it was either 85 or 88, I can't remember it, I'm old senile at this point, but they discovered that if you took the math and you added to it additional dimensions, and I think you get it up to 11 or 13, depending on how you interpret it. But if you add these additional dimensions to the math, it suddenly worked. And when we talk about dimensions, just again to try to keep it really simple, uh, a point on a piece of paper, that's one dimensional. A line on that paper is two dimensional, length and width. We and everything we interface with are three dimensional, length, width, and height. Fourth dimension is taking an object and rotating it through every possible permutation. And beyond that, my little mind can't handle it. But as you get to the number of dimensions, like I said, I think it's 11 or 13. As you get to that, suddenly the math works. You can use the same formula to calculate the movement of atoms that you can for planets. The interesting thing is, all of you've seen the Marvel movies and all of that. Marvel
Hmm.
hijacked part of this theory, um, because one of the things that is required as you get that many dimensions, you suddenly have to have infinite parallel universes, are a byproduct of that. And the idea is every action creates splinter points that basically can be existing in a parallel universe.
Mhm.
So why does this have anything to do with the paranormal? So one of the thoughts is that if our reality bumps into another reality for an infinitely small amount of time space, they're in contact. And if you think of it as two balloons, if I have a balloon here and a balloon here, and I put them together, they flatten out, right?
Mhm.
So they're still in contact over a large amount of space. But as I move them apart, they rebound back. Similarly, if I take a single balloon and I poke it, I don't have a balloon here or anything to poke it with, but if I poke it, it goes inward and injects energy into the system from my external. And when I release it, that energy rebounds and pushes an equal and opposite amount of energy back out of that system to have equilibrium. So, where this all comes into play is one theory from a paranormal perspective is where these universes touch. And my universe, it is whatever year this is. It's 2026. My universe, it's 2026, July 7th, and this other universe, it's 1864. Just because in its time doesn't have to progress the same rate ours does. Still parallel.
Mm.
Well, when those two touch, that ghost of a Civil War soldier isn't a dead person. It's the shadowed image of someone existing in their universe, in their time space. And when you start looking at paranormal that way, it changes everything. Because you can also think of it as, well, what happens if something can push its way through? So, same idea of that analogy of a balloon. I know if I'm a magician, I can put a little Vaseline on it, take a needle, and I can stick it in, and it goes beyond that veil. And when I remove it, one of two things happen. But in our universe, we have this idea of conservation of energy. So we don't believe that matter or energy can be created or destroyed. We believe it's at equilibrium. That may be an old theory because I think they're starting to prove that's wrong. But uh, if that's the idea, if you can take the needle and insert something into the balloon, what if that is our demons? What if they are nothing more than something that has slipped past that barrier? Um, do we see them the same way? No, not necessarily, because they don't belong in our universe. So what their properties aren't really bounded by ours. Can they be here for a long time? No one really knows. But the idea is, again, if they're progressing at a different time from a different time space, for them, what could be an hour or two could be 100 years here. So it's just things to start thinking about. And, particularly in these days when we're talking about disclosure of aliens and all of this, maybe that's all the same thing.
Mm.
Maybe these aliens, the demons, all of this, maybe it's one big confusing ball of twine, but it's not dead. And when you start thinking about the idea that the ghosts and things you encounter in paranormal aren't dead people, it changes everything. Because there's no reason to be lurking around haunted or allegedly haunted cemeteries and all of this stuff. It's just not. It takes all the creep factor out, um, and it gives you suddenly, from a rationalist perspective, another way to possibly wrestle with the equation. Just like when we discovered Göbekli Tepe, it changed everything we thought about our own history. Maybe this same kind of thing, maybe this M theory, if it were really embraced, would change everything. Maybe what they're talking about with aliens. I don't believe half of it's aliens. Most of it, I think, when they blamed aliens, were us doing stuff we shouldn't be doing. Um, but the whole idea is it's a paradigm shift, and freeing ourselves up from these preconceived notions gives us more ability to solve the real problems. So when I'm looking at something, a small sign at Gobekli Tepe, and I suddenly stop saying, oh, it's artwork, and suddenly start saying, is there a pattern here? And if so, what is that pattern, and how does it match other small signs that I found on, um, uh, uh, like at Tel Haran, or some of those match other little scribbles that we found there, and you suddenly open up this whole other world of possibilities.
Hmm.
And
I don't
so,
want to interrupt,
yeah,
but I do have to use the restroom. I'm sorry, guys, but I really want to hear this. If we could pause for a second, is that all right, James?
Yeah,
Yeah. Give me 1 second. I'll be right back.
I'll just do
James,
the I'll
James will do a
dance.
little dance.
Yeah, do it
Do a little
for
dance.
entertainment.
Do a little love. Get down tonight. But yeah, no, when Victoria gets back, no, but I'm vibing with everything you're saying. There's many different theories, right? Not to I'll take over for a minute so we're not just like staring at the screen, but from the psychology realm of it, you see a lot of how it's culture, and then you add elements of parapsychology or anomalous psychology, where maybe throughout time we started creating these things, these projections, and we started projecting it out into reality, and we created these manifestations that somehow gain these intelligence. We're talking a little bit about in physics now. It's physics and demonology at this point, but in the same sense, the metaphysical aspects of a lot of thought and theory have been around much longer than some sciences. And for a long time, you've heard the word artificial intelligence in a metaphysical sense, that is creating something and projecting it, and that having that intelligence outside of technology. So I love getting into deep theory like this, because it's like we have an idea, but everybody has an opinion, and we could all be wrong, and we could be thinking it's this or that. It could be dead people, or it could be demons, fallen angels, or azoras, or akashas, or the list can go on of what we could think these things are by cultural idea or tradition and thought. But I vibe with it, because we need and one thing that we try to promote on the show, Nine Gates, is trying to create that conversation, pulling back that layer, or peeling that onion layer by layer, and trying to ask these questions and present to people that are willing to listen, willing to view this and learn something and think. And I think with all of our writings, to a degree, we, like I said that about at the beginning, is we try to engage people wanting to learn, and not boxing them into the square that a lot of people live in, but explore. The earth is expansive, but the universe is expansive. And if there is a multiverse, in that negation out of Marvel, that's even crazier. And to me, I've always said, if I am proven wrong one day with my beliefs, I'm not gonna kick and scream, jump off a bridge. I ain't gonna do that, because to me, if we find a discovery, that is, to me, is more magical than not having any discovery at all, right? And to me, if it changes that it is a multiverse, or it is just cultural tradition and artificial intelligence, to me, that's not any less creepy or less paranormal or unknown or unexplainable than what we think as in maybe a pop culture sense nowadays. But it blows my mind. We can't box ourselves in a square or a box. We have to explore. We have to engage what came before us, and maybe what will be after us as well, or maybe something that is after us in another multi-universe, another universe. But get off my high horse for a second. Victoria's back. So Kyle, if you remembered your thought, please continue.
Well, I was just going to say, I completely agree with you. I get in trouble all the time for saying, I my goal is to determine what the truth is. I don't care what the truth is. I just want to know what the truth is.
Mhm.
And that gets me in trouble a lot.
Mm,
But at the same time, it gives me, at least I feel it gives me, some credibility because I don't have a horse in the race.
mm,
And, I break eggs. I try to go in and figure out things, and I don't mind pulling them apart. Um, and sometimes that comes in really handy because you realize that, again, I use that example of the creation of civilization 4,500 years ago. If we still believe that, think of all the amazing human history that we wouldn't begin to unravel,
mm.
right? We wouldn't realize that people just like us survived a mini ice age only to have everything wiped out by a flood. We our entire existence is just so phenomenal, and we shouldn't limit ourselves to our belief. Um, anyway, that gets me in a long deviation, but you know,
No, definitely, and yeah, I'll give Victoria the. I'm gonna shelve my talking point for a second. Victoria, do you have anything to add to that?
I think to me, what all of this is saying is we're not so different, are we, from early humans, from people across the sea, what have you. I think we are all trying to deal with what it is like to be human, what it is like to survive here in this existence, and that we also don't really know what happens once we die. And so we make up stories about that. And it's not to say that they're true or false, it's that we're trying to understand our reality.
Mhm.
So, yeah, I think that's what I love most about folklore, that we are so creative in how we explain the world to ourselves.
Yeah, and that one of the things I like. I'm gonna butcher this. I'm gonna paraphrase it, but one of the things that has always impacted me is every myth or folklore or belief likely stems from some sort of truth, right?
Mhm,
What that truth is the big to know, is the I don't know. We still are discovering, but we can see, as we talked about earlier, how things get passed and changed. Where that stemmed from, and that experience for that to be stated and for it to be passed along generations and God for thousands of years. Um, Fascinates me. The paranormal is exhilarating in the sense because as humans we know we're going to die, but we don't want to die, and we always want something better afterwards. And I think we all hope there's something better afterwards. There are many cultures and beliefs and traditions that say there is something afterwards, but what is the truth of that? We don't really know until, unfortunately, that light snaps off when our brain dies, and then the body goes with it. So, I, I I've done a lot of research on a lot of near death experiences and stuff, and I think there's a lot of natural explanations to that, that has actually been researched pretty extensively. But I still find it fascinating. I still find the allure, the unknown, because it is unknown. And regardless of what I was saying with Victoria when you're in the bathroom, regardless of what that unknown is, it's still magical, and it's still
right,
like that discovery, and maybe things we aren't ever meant to learn, and I really truly do believe that. But it's not bad to dig, right? Like, a lot of people say, well, you go down a rabbit hole. Assuming with you, Kyle, as you said, you've got in trouble for it, is some things that I say or talk about, it's like, okay, well, I lost my Christian badge, but it's not the fact that I lost my badge. It's the fact that the reality is people have come before us and had, I wouldn't say very much different viewpoints, but still uh, viewpoints that had similarities but a lot of differences. But that doesn't note the fact that I'm right or they're wrong. The fact is, with Victoria's statement, is that we're all human, right? And
Yeah.
I think anthropology and some other things have done injustice to humanity by breaking it up in segments. I've always hated, I'm not going to jump on this bandwagon because I'll get a lot of hate, but I've always hated the implementation of the idea of race. I think that's done us injustice in humanity, but yeah, we are all one person. We're all one being. We're all Homo sapiens or Homo sapiens because we're important. And yeah, I totally agree, Victoria.
You know, the biggest thing from a demonology perspective is people don't want to know our version of the truth. Sometimes I've had death threats. I've had times that I've done appearances literally that I've had to have a police escort.
Mhm.
So, people don't want things that sometimes challenge their belief system.
Hmm.
They're fascinated to hear it, but then as soon as they hear it, they
They get
become
angry and
enraged.
they take it out on you. No, I've seen
Yeah,
it too. Not to that level. That's a little crazy to me.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's very real. I think people want also to believe that it's a demon in their life. And we talked about this a little bit, Kyle, when I had interviewed you. But they really just want to believe that because then maybe it's not their fault and
right.
their religion will back it up that, or if that is not their environment or bad choices or happenstance, that it's not more random than that, that no, you are in a cosmic battle with this ancient entity that is trying to take your life and your soul away from you and yada yada yada. And I end up having to tell people, that doesn't sound like a demon to me at all. And they push back and they're like, well, who are you to tell me? And I'm like, you came to me. I'm a folklorist. Like, and they're like, well, I don't believe in folklore. And I'm like, what is my title? Like, you saw it. It's on there. Like, it's really frustrating, you know? I mean, well, so I guess this sort of segues, if you don't mind, James,
Go ahead.
like modern demonology, like I know you have thoughts on this. We talked about it, but modern demonology, where do you think we are now?
Well, I promised my viewers that I wasn't going to get possessed this week.
Well,
Um,
not yet.
um, I think it is well, like we've previously discussed. As someone who is in this field, I can usually tell by the inquiries I get claiming that they're being attacked or possessed. I can tell you who appeared as a demon on what TV show, what movies are out with a particular demon, what's trending on Netflix from a demonic perspective or, Prime. People are looking to latch on to anything as like you said as an excuse to not accept responsibility. And I think the more society, um, I don't want to use the term completely unravels, but as society um, gets challenged by various things occurring in it, people are under a lot of stress and they don't know how to deal with it. um, During COVID, people were in isolation and were in some cases suffering from caged animal effect. And it's one of those things that it becomes a natural release to, as you were mentioning, to blame your situation on something else.
Mhm.
And, you know, a large part of what a demonologist has to do is we play counselor. We are listening to them confess their crimes, their sins, their fears, and out of all of that, we have to triage it and say, okay, let's get past all of your personal emotional baggage, and let's start looking at what are the evidence points that you have to something actually happening. And when we take that emotional side out of it, sometimes they rage against that, but from an investigative perspective, we have to do that because we're trying to build a profile. We don't know exactly what we're facing, what we're getting into. And so just like any good investigator, here's what happened, here's the situation, here's the location, here's who was present, here are the mitigating factors, and you start to go through it just in a scientific method,
Hmm.
and you try to set it all aside. And I will tell the viewers, here and now, 99% of the demonic cases are not.
Mhm. Yep,
And
I'm trying to change the language. I told you that, like, they're infinitesimal, less than 1%.
yeah. So you,
It's
you
just
take that
not.
1%, and you can, even with that, you break down that 1% and you say, oh, okay, what are these other rational possibilities? And then beyond that, you say, okay, if it's not that, is it something like an apparition, which
Mhm.
may or may not, to some people, be more palatable than something demonic? Is it
Mhm.
the fact that they're living in a 100-year-old house that creaks? You try to go through all of those things, and literally, there was a time before COVID, I was taking 200 calls a month. And it was sometimes soar as many as 300. And you're spending hours and hours on the phone with these people. And so what I would do is people would contact me, I would reach out, interview them, and most of them, there's nothing you can do because it isn't anything that's demonic related. And then if there was something that had enough evidence, there was a child at stake, there was something threatening, then I would contact a local team, because I was getting these calls from all over the world. And I would
Mhm.
contact a local team and say, hey, can you go and do a field investigation? But I would give them the parameters of, here's your safety concerns and all of this. And then if they got involved and determined that there was nothing common that was causing it, that maybe it was something paranormal or not, then I would get involved,
Mm.
and boots on the ground.
Mhm.
And you never know when you're doing that what you're going to get involved with. I've literally had to call the Department of Child and Family Services on a case because they were
Mhm.
torturing their children with the idea
Mhm.
of a demon was going to get them for
Yeah.
violating.
And children die that way. I mean,
Mhm.
people die.
Yeah.
Exorcisms are not for the faint of heart, and they are dangerous, even when a demon is not present.
Yeah.
Right.
And yeah, there's a horrible case that happened in, I believe it was Vancouver, of a 3-year-old who was put through many exorcisms, and that poor baby died.
Yeah.
And yeah, no, I'm sure that was horrific.
Well, and you mentioned that one of the most famous exorcisms ever, or possession cases allegedly, Annitto Kyl. For those viewers out there, the movie The Exorcism of Emily Rose, or
Yep.
if
I
you're a
just looked. Yeah.
German, if
Yeah.
you're a German viewer, Requiem, um, was version of that case. And in this poor young lady's case, um, the priest decided he wanted to become famous. This is right as the movie The Exorcist was getting popular and the book The Exorcist was getting popular. He decided he wanted to give up the priesthood to become a lecturer, but he needed a good exorcism case to pay the bills. And so he took this, and literally all the horrible pictures. So if you Google Annalisa Mickle, you'll see all of these horrible pictures of her. And what literally happened is she was already suffering from grand mal seizures. She had pleurisy. She had neurological. She had all of these different medical issues going on. But the priest chose to ignore that. And she was in a family that was already highly religious.
Mhm.
And so they just played off of that. And so it's part of the exorcism. So, from a Catholic exorcism perspective, an exorcism lasts 30 minutes, give or take. And that involves some prayers, some supplications, and then the priest ordering the demon to leave. And then in between each 30-minute session, part of it is you get down on your knees and then prostrate yourself. If you could see, I would have my hands stretched if I wasn't in this narrow frame. But you prostrate yourself and do a Hail Mary or a recitation of a prayer. And you do this over and over again. And on Alicia's case, she did it, and you're only supposed to do, by the way, no more than 3 or 4 a day, and then you don't do them every day. But they had her doing it 8 to 12 times a day, and they did it 5 to 7 days a week. And over time, that destroyed her knees because she kept getting down on her knees over and over again. The other thing that in her case happened is um, she was told by the priest that fasting was part of the getting closer to God. So she stopped eating. So this beautiful 16, 17-year-old girl becomes a virtual skeleton. The pictures of her you'll see, there's one of them that her teeth are smashed out. And the myth is that um, you know, that was part of the possessions action, but it really wasn't. It's the fact that she couldn't walk and she fell and hit her head on a table. And all of this eventually leads to her dying of malnutrition.
Hmm.
And this is in Germany, and the US had imposed a law in Germany that there was complete religious exemption from crimes, religious freedom. And so the priest said that this was all part of the exorcism. So even though the two priests involved were found guilty of murder
Hmm.
and the parents were found guilty of murder, the priest got off with literally a fine that was less than it was basically less than court cost. And the parents got literally a slap on the wrist for murdering their daughter. And even after she was buried, a few months later, her mother got told by some prophet that her body would, if she was truly possessed, would be preserved. And so they dug her up again to check to see if she was possessed. So this is just one of many
Yeah.
examples. If you ever see an exorcism in the news, if they still have news, if you ever see one in the news or read it online of an exorcism killing someone, it's literally because the exorcist had them beat it out of them. I've actually a few times in my past have had to literally walk out of a situation during an exorcism, um, but it, because it wasn't an exorcism, it was a torture.
Yeah. Yeah, I find that interesting. I actually wrote about that case in my first book, The Psychological Dimensions of the Paranormal, which takes a little bit of a different route of viewing the paranormal. It's really not a biased approach, it's kind of walking a fine line. But I talk finally about that case. I use that as an example, as a what if, if you actually learn all the details of it, it kind of puts a bad taste in your mouth and you get a pit in your stomach. There's a lot of details to that a lot of people do not know, and you expressed a lot of them today. I lost my point of oh, what I wanted to get to on what you were saying about boots on the ground,
Mhm.
investigating, researching, consultation. I still do it to this day, quite extensively. But one thing you said at the beginning of this show, which I found very fascinating, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, even though my title is demonologist, and I do love your title of demonologist, is that it does get a demonology does get a negative notion, and it's the fact that. s- And I'm not throwing harpoons at anybody or throwing shade at anybody, but we have come to a point in modern demonology where a lot of people now call themselves a demonologist without no academic training, no self learning, or mentoring under somebody that has a lot of knowledge. Um, and I think one of the things that I try to do differently, and I think Victoria does as well, even though she doesn't call herself a demonologist, is that we are trying to take the fear away from it, and not in the sense that, okay, possibly these situations are real, and Victoria had her situation. I'm assuming you've seen some things that have shook you. I have seen things that have shook me. It is real, but we have to take the fear out of it, because like you said, 99% of the situations that come forth to us are normal, natural, rational explanations that sometimes you have to talk them off the ledge, to say, okay, well, what happened? And I really like that point that you said it has a negative notion to it, because it does. And there's so many people that have used it as an essence to get themselves on television or get themselves that fame and fortune or that notoriety, like some other people, as you digressed in that story of Annalise McCall. Um, and how some people use it as a way of becoming somebody. And anybody that actually does this line of work, we had John Zaffis on the show before, and we have a multitude of guests lined up until January. Uh, it, they all will say that it is real, but they all have different explanations of it. And I find that fascinating. But I also find it fascinating is that most of us agree that it is very rare. And what it is either our theories that we discussed or things that we might not think of. Is that we have to dispel that fear. We have to give that knowledge out to people and say, hey, think of this before you jump to that conclusion. Is your personal baggage outweighing your ability to be objective and not subjective? So, and I think we could see that throughout all of history as well. I think one of the dearest pieces of modern history that I latch onto is not even the Salem witch trials, but the European Inquisition. It was bloody. Thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of people died. And there are various numbers that are disclosed and speculated on how many people died. But we have points in history where sometimes that fear becomes actual human levels of evil.
I do want to add to that for people, who it's not that we're saying demons aren't scary. If you were to meet a real one, it's going to be terrifying. You'll never forget it. But the fear of them has gotten to a point that is so overblown, so over sensationalized, that you have more chance of your car blowing up when you turn the ignition when you get into it, right? And most of us do not have our cars blowing up on a regular basis. We're not even thinking about it when we turn the ignition. And really, the way engines work, I was married to a mechanic, and then, my friend's a mechanic too. But like, it's like a small explosion in your car. That's why your engine turns over. But that was something that somebody else that I interviewed for Hell, Horror, and Despair put out. He's like, yeah, you have more of a chance of your car blowing up. But we're not thinking about that, are we, when we turn the ignition, because it's so low? Because that isn't the norm. And I that is something I wish people understood. But the truth is, there is a lot going on currently that is forcing the demon narrative,
Hmm.
which, first, entertainment, it ups the ante. It makes it way more exciting. People are like, oh my God, it's demon. Because it's like, if they had a true understanding of what a demon could do, they wouldn't want that at all. Because in horror, it's like a ghost, but worse. And they have no idea what they're talking about. And I deal with that a lot. Like, people find out what I do, and then they tell me something, and I'm like, where to begin with that one? Like, I have to go back to, like, okay, well, where'd you get that idea? Well, unfortunately, that's not true. I try to gently correct people, but people don't have to listen to me. They don't have to listen to any of us.
I,
I'm doing the best I can.
I think when you actually come face to face, so to speak, with a daemon or demonic, we a lot of times play rodeo clown.
Mhm.
Um, we make ourselves the target. Um, I'll give you an example. I won't go into the details of the case, but I had a situation years ago where there was something very, very wrong going on. And it was in August in Atlanta, and it was one of those really, really hot summers. So we were kind of like it is right now, 100-degree weather every day. And a particular case that I was working went south very rapidly. And I encountered the entity, and it told me I was cold. See, possession isn't like you see on Supernatural. We're not meat suits, right? Nothing slides into us. When you get into looking at the original words to it, the word we now say is possession really doesn't mean that. It means to be suggested. And so it's hearing a voice in your head that's your voice, that's your thoughts. And so in this particular case, it said I was cold. And so for the next 6 weeks, I was literally wrapped in blankets, wearing heavy winter coats in 100-degree weather. I went to doctors and they said there's nothing physically wrong with you other than you are burning yourself up with your own blankets and your own coat. And it's one of those things that you never get past. I've had another case just to kind of illustrate, not as extreme to that point, but I had a case I was working, and I had a support team with me, and we went into a particular area of this location that we hadn't done anything in yet. We had set up some cameras, and we went in, and one of the rules for any kind of paranormal thing is if you're in a place you don't know the situation, if you have a team, you never abandon your team members ever. And in this particular case, everybody had just, we'd had a break. They'd done the bathroom thing, changed their flashlights. We walk into this room, and two of them simultaneously, and we know it was simultaneously because I've got it on video, say, my batteries are dead. I can't see. And they turned and abandoned us. The third person's like, I gotta go pee bad, and abandoned me. And their flashlights were working. The guy who had to go to the bathroom had just gone to the bathroom. And they thought, and they couldn't overcome it, that they had that situation occurring. So, being a demonologist, like I said, we're rodeo clowns. We're there to take the bullet. We try to help the person before you ever get to that point. But once you start facing the real thing, you never know. One of the toys I use, and you've probably seen these before, Furba.
Yes.
I,
Yes.
I, I have a collection of them. This particular one is about 300, 200, 300 years old. It's an altar version, so it's bigger than normal. But these are weapons from Tibet, Nepal, and India. This particular one is from Tibet. And the idea, just for the viewers, is it's made of 3 segments. It has the 3 faces of the god Vajra. And it's made of 1, 3, or 7 metals. It basically is a lightning rod, so it sucks energy out of the system.
Mm-hmm.
And one way to think about it, the 3 layers could be past, present, future, earth, sky, water, and even the trinity of the god itself. But the idea is the difference. We talked earlier about the Alexandrian divide, right? Everything to the west of it believes you can't kill a demon. You can't hurt a demon because it's intangible and immortal. But east of it, as Arnold Schwarzenegger says, if it bleeds, I can kill it. And these are made of metal now.
Mm-hmm.
Used to be about 1,000 years ago, they were made of wood. I actually have in my collection a couple wood ones. You would be crucified to the ground, so through that and then the feet, to ground the demon.
Mm-hmm.
It's a 3-pointed blade. I don't know if y'all can see that. But,
Yeah, I love Keelas or Furbas. Yeah.
the thing is,
Yeah.
medically, up until literally World War II, if you were ever stabbed by a tri-blade, and these were actually outlawed under the Geneva Convention, if you were stabbed by a three-pointed blade, medically you would never heal. We had nothing that would allow that you to suture it back and let it grow back correctly. Today, even with microsurgery, if you get stabbed by a tri-blade, it still is a permanent weak spot that you have to be extra careful about. So that's the cool thing about these anyway. But the very fact that it's a lightning rod and it takes energy out of a system.
Mm.
Someone somewhere 1,000 years ago said, "Hey, what if we did this?" So anyway,
Yeah.
that's the toys I use. I've got one that was auctioned by Sotheby's in the 70s, and that particular one, I should have brought that one out, but I didn't. That one, it turned out after I got it, was considered one of the top 100 most cursed items on the planet.
Mm.
And it had a curse on it, still does, where whoever takes possession of it has 95 acts of destruction or contrition that have to happen to keep the blade. And I didn't know this when I got it. There's a whole set of
You do
rules.
now.
Yeah, I do.
That's
The
awesome.
one of the things, the rules had been that you had to ask for it. No one could offer it to you. And I was driving and I saw a knife show, and I never go to a knife show. And I went in and I asked, went straight to this one dealer, asked him if he had a FURBA, and he did. And so it's weird. It's really weird. But yeah,
I
Yeah.
think it's awesome personally, but
Yeah, I love the FURBA because I've heard so many stories. You know, like you said, it's a lightning rod absorbs energy, and the tip vanquishes it. I've heard people of stabbing into a bowl of rice, the ground to vanquish, to disperse. That that energy it contained, and in a way, right? That kind of idea, and further back with effigies and stuff like that, the idea of actually containing energy or spirit to an item like an effigy or a dagger has of course catapulted to pop culture today, as we can
yeah.
see with haunted objects everywhere, like everywhere. But I want to ask one last question, and Victoria does, but we got to wrap it up because we're hitting basically almost that 2 hour mark. We have about 10, 20 more minutes left.
Okay.
But one thing I want to ask you, and in history of demonology, as expansive it is, and through the multi diverse way we can look at it, you kind of already said it to a degree, but I'm looking for maybe a different perspective of it. If there is one piece of the history of demonology, what point in history fascinates you the most revolving this topic?
I really hit on it. The very fact that our earliest so far decipherable languages um, tell that story. They create this purification rituals in Sumer and the Akkadian Empire that we're still using today. And so much of our modern religious structure can be directly traced back to that. And that's what I find fascinating. I'll be reading a good example. I was working on, as I mentioned on the dissertation side, I was working on this whole underworld cycle thing. And as I was putting all of these pieces together, I realized, wow, there is a common mourning ritual that we used for 4,000 years, that you cut yourself as part of mourning. And you even see a prohibition against it in the early Jewish text. Book of Kings and Leviticus are both good examples of it. And to realize that we had a commonality in how we mourned the dead. And then there was also another thing that I stumbled across was for 4,500 years, there was another ritual that said that you couldn't be around death. So you weren't allowed to go hang out with the body, so to speak, like we did in the old South for 3 days. There was a prohibition generally where nothing divine could be encountering someone dead. So a priest, for example, when someone died, a priest did not get involved originally with the dead body because that depurified the priest. There's a Greek passage where Apollo has one of his favorites who's dying, and Apollo says, I can't be here when you die because that will corrupt my divinity. And I found that pattern again all the way back to the earliest gods where death is this prohibition. And then the other thing that to me was just kind of silly, stupid, was everybody, well, a lot of people who've studied Greek know the story of Persephone being kidnapped and raped or taken down into the underworld. And her mother, Demeter, protests to try to get her back. But Zeus is the one who's actually the bad guy in that story, and he's the one who sold her out to his brother Hades. But there's a rule that they talk about in the hymn of Demeter or Demeter that says if you eat anything while you're in the underworld, you can't get away from the underworld.
Mhm.
And what I was amazed to find out, in that case, it was a pomegranate seed, but I actually was able to reconstruct that all the way back to some of the earliest Sumerian tablets talking about get death in the underworld. And, you know, what that, to put it in real terms, to pull that folklore side into it, people believed that if you left an offering for the dead, to consume it was prohibited. And that's where it comes from. And so it was a way to honor the dead.
That's interesting. So what that really makes me think, right, is death has been giving us the willies since the beginning of time. And that's amazing.
Well, I'll slightly disagree with you.
Sure.
Because one of the things we found, I mentioned Katahuyuk, and I just briefly mentioned like Karahan Tepe and the Taz Tepler stuff around Göbekli Tepe.
Mhm.
We found that they bury their ancestors' heads underneath the floor to keep
Interesting.
their ancestors. And amazingly, years ago, I was playing Indiana Jones in just south of Cusco in a little bakery village, and you walk into the bakery village, and their grandfather's head is hanging over the door of the bakery. So it's this weird dichotomy where they believe that having the piece of it used to be that having the piece of the ancestor in your home blessed the home by bringing the ancestor there. But to your point, yeah, starting in Sumer forward, that's exactly the case. Um,
Well, it
so
depends on where the convergence of thought
right,
started, right? Like somewhere along the line, people were like, no, if we bring a piece of our ancestor in, that'll work. And it reminds me of like Catholic reliquaries of
mhm.
saints. And I've always wondered, like, where does that come from? Because I'm not Catholic. I have no basis for that idea. Nice.
I have a relic right there.
Nice. So,
No, yeah, and I agree with that. I think it's interesting too. There's Catholics do have a big thing against urns being in your house, right? With your ashes. We still see that to this day, where there's like, okay, keep it away. It's they're moved on. This could bring some bad juju. Um, I did want to ask one more question before Victoria takes over before we end this segment. Is if you had one thing to tell somebody that wants to get into demonology, what would you tell them?
Don't um, study the history, study the religion, study the cultures. Don't get involved in demonology. Um,
um, something from your book I thought was really like hit home for me is you talked about how a lot of demonologists like are holing up in libraries. This isn't the awesome adventure and you're fighting these things you can't see. We are in libraries. We're researchers a lot of the time.
yeah,
So
um, it's not worth the knowledge. I can't stop learning. Um, I it's that's just something that's part of my core as an individual, but it's at a cost. You give
Mhm.
up um, you give up part of you because ultimately, as someone who is putting yourself out there, I used the example of the rodeo clown. When you're out there, you don't put other people in your world in a position where they are the soft target to get to you. And I've seen that happen. And so, you know, field work, never, ever, ever would I recommend someone get involved in that. Um, it's just not worth it. There are people who need it, and I can't tell you how many times I have walked away from it. Um, but the problem is, in my case, once you've been out into that element, um, sooner or later, even when you try to walk away, something drags you back in. Um, there's a kid that needs help. There's a mother who is being tortured. And you just can't say no to someone who's begging for help because they think that not only their life but their soul depends on it. And it's a heavy weight, and I would never ever encourage anybody to get into it. And that's part of the reason why I write books about it, because I want people to know the truth. I don't want them to have to learn it the hard way. um, One of the things I did in one of my books that really got people irritated was, but it got me rewarded. But I disproved Lucifer. Lucifer's a typo, a transcription error. He doesn't
I heard about that.
exist. And it's when people hear that, they there's a reaction. But I felt that once I understood that, once I unraveled the pieces, that by putting it out there, at least someone has the option to learn it. Um, but in any of my books, I always encourage people, and even when I lecture, one of the first things I say in my lectures is, "Don't get involved in this directly. It's not worth it."
Yeah.
It destroys our bodies too. I mean, I everybody I know is suffering from something because they do this. Even I, who I'm on the research side of everything, I have some kind of issue where that I can't fix. I'm gonna have to have medical intervention, which I can't afford, because there is something about it that draws you in, but not everyone's supposed to do it. And I personally believe it'll pull your life apart at the seams if you are not meant to do this.
Yeah.
I keep getting drawn back in. I'd like to believe that it's because I'm supposed to, but someday there might be a day where I have to stop.
I should have stopped after my second death. But some people don't learn.
Well,
Yeah, I agree with that. I've stepped away many times. Personal mistakes, things going on, transference from clients, and dealing back with their emotional baggage in your own life. It is hard. It is being a therapist on crack, as I like to note it. You're working with so many different algorithms at play, trying to understand the situation, trying to help them to the best of your ability. But I think that what you said, Kyle, was fantastic. I know a lot of people that have done this for a long time. Me, not as long as you, but I always say the same thing. It's like it's not a roller coaster ride. It's not a key to success. It's a
mhm,
key. It's a key to a lot of disaster in life. Yeah, you might be respected because of your knowledge and listened and have a following, but that means nothing when you're dealing with your own the ramifications of it in your own life, and your family's dealing with it. So, I think that was a commanding way to tell people to be cautious what you want. And Victoria, before we wrap this up, do you have anything else to add?
Not really, except, thank you for being here and for sharing your knowledge with us because, yeah, I really do feel like we all got a degree tonight. Do you teach?
No, because I'm slack.
But you're
I,
amazing at it, just so
I,
you know.
I do lecture periodically. I think the next one I'm doing is, I know I've got one in, or several in October.
Oh, cool.
I'm doing a convention in Macon, Georgia. Um, I used to do a lot. I used to lecture all the time,
Mhm.
but health, and I have puppies. Uh,
No.
you may hear them every once in a while. We'll have whining in the background, but um, so I don't try to do as many of those. Um, I should do probably more to do it. Lately, my books have kind of been the the best I can offer for
Yeah.
now.
Mhm.
So on that note, before you either step in the back room or leave, we're gonna wrap it up with another like couple minutes to wrap
Mhm.
the show up. But if you want to stay, please do. But before I bring you into the back room, where can people find your books? Where can people learn more about you? Um, give give your details and plug away.
Okay. Well, paranormal books. So I have Ghost and Demons: The Lost Thing. Actually, this is the second edition that just came out about a year ago. Um, I wrote this is a paranormal textbook, so it explains all the science behind it. It's got a section on demons that explains kind of a lot of what we talked about tonight. It also has actual my research on demonic cases. The interesting thing about this book, I've never had planned to do a second edition, but my first edition got used as a textbook to teach paranormal students around the world. And I had a university, or actually two universities in Australia, that adored the book and actually asked the publisher. They said if I did a second edition, that they would commit to a run on it for their students. So
That's
anyway,
awesome.
that was cool for me. Anyway, that's called The Lost Things. And then I have a demon book called Forgotten Lore, and
I have that one.
that's looking at 14 named demons. And it has like a general section on some of the Alexandrian stuff and talking about Sumerian demons and things like that.
Mhm.
These are all available on Amazon. And then I have one. I have a bunch of other unrelated, but I do have one that's not related that I still want to pimp. I have the book called The Love God. All right, this shows you how obsessive compulsive I am. So about 15 years ago, I wrote a history book for my hometown, and I found a paragraph talking about a con man that came and married a woman and stole all her money in my hometown of Griffin, Georgia. And that just haunted me. And so I ended up tracking him down, and it turns out this guy went all over the country, married women, stole their money under different names. He was on a presidential campaign. He was going to be nominated for the first U.S. senator from North Dakota. He was run for Congress. He eventually he marries each one of these women, so he becomes a bigamist. He eventually gets run out of the U.S., founds a sex cult in New Zealand. And I became so obsessed with this guy. I found not only his whole history, but I found he paid to have his sermons published in a New Zealand newspaper. So I hand transcribed 120 sermons in a poorly safe newspapers to reconstruct this guy's whole theology and history and all this. Anyway, the love God.
Sounds fascinating. Wow.
Yeah,
That's
no,
it.
I'm posting your links on the thing right now. So if the viewers want to go to them, for people that will listen on Spotify, it is www.sirkyl.com, SIRKYL.com. And then you also have, oh, you also have the lovegod.com.
Yep.
So
And
if you're interested in looking up Kyle, please do so. He's also on Facebook and I think socials. So
one more website to pimp,
Yeah.
Last, Last, gasp, GASPS. That's the paranormalsite.com.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah, I posted it on there for people. So please follow Kyle. Kyle, thank you once again for coming on tonight with us. I think people that watched tonight learned a lot. The people that will listen or watch after this, uh, uh, goes to, of course, stagnant viewing in the sense of people watching it not live, is that people are going to learn a lot and reach out to Kyle, get his books, pick his brain, and maybe eventually down the road we'll have a part two with you, Kyle, in the new year. Our plan is to have a long journey on this. But once again, thank you.
My pleasure. Y'all have a great evening.
You
You
too.
too. Okay.
Whoa.
Yeah.
What a show. What an episode. I learned things that I didn't think I was gonna learn tonight, but that was the expectation we stated at the beginning. Where people are gonna learn. Like
Yeah.
I really felt like I just got a degree in ancient religions, but I can't say that because he's put a lot of hard work into that,
Mhm.
and you can tell how he retains knowledge is
Unbelievable. Yeah. Like just the amount of things that we learned about just in 2 hours, that is an entire repository of knowledge. And yeah, no, like I really hope we do it part two so that we can hear more about what Kyle has found. And that
yeah.
like it I'm very happy about all this because it's like, yes, this is exactly what I wanted. I wanted to learn from the experts in our field
Hmm.
about the things that maybe I don't know as much about. Because history of demonology, of course, we have the foundations, right? I'm not a demonologist. I don't call myself that. I don't feel like I do what you guys do, but I did still have to look at the history of demonology to understand evil spirits back then versus now so that I could explain the progression.
Yeah.
Um, and my knowledge, I'm realizing, is not big enough. Like, and that's wonderful.
Yeah, in reality, this topic was the history of demonology, just like we had John in the first episode. We really just, in earnest, really hit the tip of the iceberg
Yeah.
with the history. Like, this could be a 5 hour topic that we, a 5 hour or 5 year topic we could discuss.
50
And
hour, I could see it.
yeah, it could be extensive, but we hit the tip of the iceberg. But really, what we wanted to show you tonight, and really what kind of Kyle articulated for us, is that it is so expansive. I wrote a little book to get people, the average reader, involved in the history of demonology, get a little bit of a taste of it. And that's what we got tonight as well, from a different perspective and different viewpoints. And, kind of a melding of all these different things that people don't realize. And
Mhm.
I really hope people learn something from tonight and take away and want to actually dig deeper.
Mhm. Me too. I mean, because here's the truth, like we are dealing in the realm of belief. Belief is something that is central to human beings. We all have our beliefs. Some of them can be shaken, some of them can be changed. Some of them are so core to us that we can't face that. But I would like, what I hope is going to happen is that people consider it.
Mm,
That's all I really ask when people come to my presentations or have me on their podcast. Because, yeah, a lot of people reject the things I'm saying, and that is okay. You're allowed to do that.
mhm.
Um, but I just ask that you think about it a little bit. I mean, I never really thought about how, what if those energies we're coming across that we view as ghosts aren't dead? I never thought about it like that until tonight. And I'm like, oh my God, like that would change the
Mhm.
way we view that. I mean, energy is neither created nor destroyed, but it's like I also don't know what I believe about that. I'm not really a ghost person. That isn't
Yeah.
my area, but
Mhm.
it's fascinating all the same.
And what's actually fascinating too, to kind of announce the next topic in August, which we'll post a flyer on the next day or two, say or so. We actually are going to have Steve A. Wiggins on. He earned his talking about Kyle earning his doctorate. Steve Wiggins earned his doctorate in ancient religions at Edinburgh University. He's currently an independent scholar and blogger and the author of Holy Horror, Nightmares with the Bible, and Sleepy Hollow as American Myth. And the topic, and I know you were so excited, I had to get him for you because I know you love his work, and I've been diving deep into it as well. And he is such a brilliant mind.
Mhm.
Is the topic will be de- m- demons and media, or media and
Mhm.
demons, and I think that's going to be a fantastic episode too, to roll off of kind of what Kyle is saying and how he's going to look at it as being a doctorate, being
Mhm.
having a PhD, and kind of getting idea of what his books are based on and how myth and all these things have tangled into pop culture and how it's interpreted, how we see it as a daily viewer of entertainment and pop culture.
And that's like that right there was basically what my second book was about. And I used his work so heavily, I might as well just have been like, this is all because of Steve A. Wiggins. So I'm very excited to meet him and talk to him, because his ideas about what was happening and why this was happening were so important to me. And he writes in such a way, he is funny, he is very accessible, and I
Hmm.
think not every academic is like that. I hail from academia, and I don't necessarily like academia. I think there's a lot of flowery language and people trying to confuse each other. There's a lot of ego.
Yeah,
And now I've never met Steve, so I don't know. Maybe he does have an ego, but he would have earned it, in my opinion.
yeah, for
You know?
sure. Yeah, I'm
So
excited. That's going to be August 4th, and definitely don't miss it. We might have some small content coming out here or there to fit in between the month gaps that we do. Something we're working on, maybe if questions that are asked outside of this live segment, either things people listen on Spotify or watch afterwards and send us questions, maybe answer your questions, maybe uh, talk about kind of intermediary topics between history and media. We're
mhm.
working on something to try to give you guys more content, kind of give you a little bit more of our minds as well, both
'Cause we
between our
miss you
book.
guys. This is
Yeah,
fun for us.
it is.
We love doing this. We love to hear other people's ideas. Um, this is a place of learning for all of us,
Yep.
but also it is a place for us to show you what we've learned, and what we have found. Because I personally believe in any subject. Yes, traditional academic education, it can be important, but it isn't the only thing that's important. I think experience really is important in the paranormal as well, on having your wheelhouse. Because yeah, I kind of agree. I used the word expert, but it wasn't because I was saying I am an expert. It was because I was saying I'm not. Um, that it was we have our wheelhouses, we have our research subjects, we have the things that we maybe are a little more knowledgeable about than other people, but are we really experts on a field that we can't fully prove exists?
Mhm.
I don't really think so, but I think that we have knowledge that we can share with you, and we want to.
Very true, Victoria. And on that note, thank you for everybody that has listened to our second episode, History of Demonology. And we really hope that you follow us on this journey, and you hopefully you learn something, and hopefully you take this and want to dig deeper. Everybody have a good night.